If you'd like to help us continue making Hainai, you can subscribe to our Patreon at patreon.com/HainaiPod, or donate to us on our Ko-fi, that's ko-fi.com/HainaiPod. The support would mean the world to us, especially right now, because we aren't earning that much on ad revenue, so Patreon and Ko-fi are pretty much the main ways you can support us financially. And if you join our Patreon, you actually get episodes earlier and ad-free, even at the lowest tier, with higher tiers including bonus art, as well as our now monthly bonus episodes. So if you want to listen to more bonus episodes, please do subscribe to us to the Ate tier, that's the $10 tier, on the Hainai Patreon.
You're listening to Hainai by Motzie Dapul. Episode 41. Danny Boy.
Welcome back. Please, take a seat. Enjoy a drink. Let Miss Bessie soothe your senses. Or shall I instead spin you a tale? You didn't seem too keen on it last time, but... all right. I know you're looking for her. You don't have to worry. She's all right, your beloved. She'll come back to you soon. In the meantime, let me tell you a story. Sense memory through time, pulled from the guilt of a man that he's carried for 90 years, though he was once blind to it. Clarity is suffering for some. This insight was allowed to me by our goddess of the lost, by the one-eyed moon, who, despite having no power in a foreign land, still overlooked the same sky, and saw the poor thing who most feared the man called Sauvard. Once upon a time, there was a little girl, an urchin, who wandered the streets of Toronto, cared for only by the churches, who gave her food in exchange for lectures, and called her the devil when she refused to stay on. She had a full name once, Florence or Florinda or some such, but anyone who knew her only knew her as Flo, and there was barely anyone who knew her, barely anyone who knew she was a brave girl. She was a brave girl. Her mother said so, before. And that was sometimes all that got her through. There were people who were nice to her, though. One of the nuns was young, and gave her sweets when the other nuns weren't looking. Gave her an unsisterly wink, and sent her on her way. There was a flower girl she befriended when she chased off some boys who were shoving her. And then there was old Antoine. Antoine was a skinny man with clothes ever too big for him, so heavy and loose that it was almost like he fit them once, with a healthy frame, and then eventually shrank within, never taking them off. He had a beard so scraggly and so caked with dried spittle that it hardened like wire, just hardly warming his face in the winter. He was always spitting venom, saying words Flo was sure would get her ears boxed if she repeated them round the sisters, but he was, well, he was kind. He shared his food with her when she was hungry, called her stupid, used words for her she didn't fully understand, but made sure she was warm on the chillier days. And one day, he was gone. No. He was taken. Flo remembered it well. Awakening in the dead of night, trying to rouse Antoine, but he'd imbibed too much that night, and Flo didn't have enough time to wake him before the constable came. By that time, she'd crawled into a space between piles of lumber and watched as her friend was dragged off to the jailhouse, booked for vagrancy or drunkenness or both. If they'd seen her, she'd just as likely have been booked for theft, too many instances to count, and thrown in with him. Carefully, taking advantage of the lateness of the hour, she made her way over to the police headquarters, where they'd bring her friend. Climbed up high enough to look through one of the windows. She wasn't as fast as a horse and carriage, so by the time she arrived, he was already slumped over in a solitary cell, awake, but no less out of it. She didn't have much time to plan, but wondered if she could call out to him, find a way to get him free, when the door to the cell swung open, and the officer leading the way was accompanied by an imposing, well-dressed man. He filled the space, tall enough that his tall hat near scraped the ceiling, his hair underneath a distinguished gray. He looked around in clear disgust, and used his cane to touch the jail bars, eyes scanning the few inmates. When he stopped at Antoine's cell, Antoine came to life, spitting in the man's direction and cursing him in his native French. The man seemed unfazed, tapping Antoine's cell door twice, and the officer opened the door, cuffing him and shoving him out. Flo, her heart beating right out of her chest like a trapped bird, jumped down from her perch and ran to the front, seeing a fine black automobile that she guessed belonged to the strange aristocrat, and jumping on the back. She was so small and so covered in filth that she was invisible in the shadows, and she heard more than saw Antoine being loaded into the car, with the old man and the officer accompanying him. She held on for dear life as the automobile brought them out from Toronto's dirty streets into the places Flo had never seen. Far-apart mansions for the elite, surrounded by beautiful gardens and lawns, in an eerie silence that Flo couldn't consider peaceful. When they finally arrived at some lord or tycoon's home, Flo snuck round the back, wary of the servants and butlers watching the doors. It took her some time, for the house was enormous, but she eventually got to a back window, looking into a gigantic central hall, where a veritable crowd of people had gathered. They all fell into silence when the tall man walked in, Antoine dragged behind him. He was still spitting venom, which made one of those in attendance laugh, hand over her mouth. Flo didn't know why they'd taken him here, and neither did he. But he sounded terrified. Flo was too, but she didn't know why. Couldn't name what sank her heart like a stone, as she watched Antoine be positioned in the middle of the room, at the center of a strange, drawn circle on the polished floor, surrounded by small objects. What came next? Well, the gathered elders in that room were protected from. But Flo, near enough to observe, was not. Ironically, this brought her more clarity than these elders could ever dream of, as she watched a series of spells activate around her poor old friend. And he, and his dear friend at the window, were shot through with pure, unadulterated fear. Flo's heart felt like it had escaped out of her chest, unable to draw breath into her lungs as she saw her nightmares made real. lived 100 times over. Her mother, freezing to death in the cold many months after her father had beaten her limp and driven them out of the house. The feeling of a hand trying to wrench her off a high window before Antoine beat the other man bloody. In this very moment, watching Antoine scream and writhe as others watched on, saying nothing, allowing it all to happen. Flo heard the breath escape his lungs, watched him go limp, life draining from his eyes. Her own heart stopped, for only a moment, when the tall man stepped forward, and his ice blue eyes found her at the window, sharp as a knife. She fell to the ground, and did not get up the whole night, the moon shining full above her. She would ever fear those eyes, when the sisters found her half dead in the streets, taking her into the church and eventually the infirmary. She would see those eyes in her nightmares, speaking of the devil magicians among the rich. The sisters, they believed her, but it was something they could not act on themselves, for they had little control over those who moved Toronto with a point of a ringed finger. Many years later, when the ward burned down, Flo knew who was responsible. And that night, she prayed. She prayed that one day, those eyes of ice would melt with the tears of loss, and that the tall man would know fear and suffering unimaginable. 1,000 times over what she felt because of him. She doesn't know that her prayers were heard, after a fashion. She never saw the man's heart stop, like hers. Never saw it break, like hers did, long ago.
Afraid of him? Of course I was afraid of him. There's good reason to be, I think. He's dangerous. I've listened to the other stories you shared, heard the good and the bad. I know who this man is, and I wanted to give some insight of my own, based on my experience with him, because it seems like I'm the only one who ever actually got to speak with him. Trust me or don't, but I'd have to explain why this matters so much. About a year ago, I started noticing something off. I wasn't sure why at first, but I started experiencing a series of incidences. Things I would have chalked up to bad luck if it was just the once. But it wasn't. I counted maybe 13? Could have been more, but those were the ones that left an impact. At first, I was just caught in the rain. Lost my shoe when it fell into an open canal. My favorite shirt ripped. I couldn't find the stuff that I needed for work. A customer at the cafe spilled coffee on me. Thankfully not boiling, but it was still pretty hot. My car broke down, though I still had public transportation. The TTC was late a few times, but honestly, that's probably a sign that things were normal. And it started to get worse. I got scratched by something sharp when someone bumped me in the subway. I hit my head slipping on a puddle. I almost got hit by a speeding car as it ran a red light in the intersection. It was getting to me, but I was going to try to power through it. Maybe pay a few bucks to that mystic in Kensington to look me over and give me a good luck charm or whatever. Walk into a church to... No, probably not. They might have tried to exorcise me or something. I kid. But when it started getting a lot worse, I started, seeing things. Like figures. Shadows. Like people watching me, waiting for me to... I saw them, but I didn't notice them much at first. Thought they were just some bystanders who stopped walking when they saw me get hurt, or my close calls. I only realized what they were later. I was dealing with it. I could still deal with it. Until it came to my home. I live with my parents and 2 younger siblings. Basically still babies compared to me, preparing for the empty nest syndrome for whenever I find my own place. Real optimistic on their part, what with Toronto prices. But I love them. They're great. I have great parents. And my siblings, they're sweet kids. I don't know what happened, if it meant to make any sense at all. But they were in the kitchen, and there was a stove fire. Parents still had an old gas stove, and it got lit somehow. Caught some newspaper. A freak accident. Well on its way to burning our cupboards when I got the fire extinguisher working and put it out. My siblings were right there at the table, screaming, terrified, coughing from the smoke. I got them out front and called 911, told them what happened. They were good kids. They knew not to touch the stove without help. They're not actually babies, 6 and 8, but still too young to be touching dangerous kitchen tools. Everything was locked down, and they were just at the table. The older one, let's call him Bobby. He told me he just looked at the stove and saw it was on. Didn't know how. My mom cooks, but she's never, ever forgotten to turn that thing off. The newspaper had fallen on the stove, somehow. Maybe a breeze from 2 open windows somewhere in the house, I don't know. They couldn't explain the fire. Just one of those things, the firefighters said when they checked the old thing over. No ignition, no reason it would have done anything other than leak gas, which was a problem all on its own. My mom blamed herself when they rushed home. Dad kept telling her it was a freak accident, but kept promising they'd get one of those new induction-type stoves. No more open flames, no more gas. Lucky I was there, he said. Lucky I put it out before my siblings got hurt. But I remember, when I took their hands and led them out onto the lawn to breathe some fresh air, seeing a dark shadow, no, a figure, across the road. Watching us. Waiting. Waiting for when my luck finally ran out. I needed to figure things out, so I went to stay with a friend for a night. I wasn't sure how it all worked yet, and I needed a place to stay that wasn't home around the kids. The night I stayed, we almost got carbon monoxide poisoning when the alarm didn't go off. The only reason we noticed before it got too bad was that the neighbor's dog was barking like crazy, and I saw another one of those horrible, dark, shadowy strangers watching us from outside the window. I could finally see it then. It was smiling. It was like I could count all its tall, gray teeth between its pitch-black gums. It wasn't safe. I had to get out. Gave my friend some excuse I don't remember, and I just walked away. I had an overnight bag, some change of clothes, a charger, all that, but I didn't know where to go. Couldn't stay with anyone. Just had to keep moving. Maybe get to one of the parks and sleep under a tree or something. It was a chilly night. Not quite winter, but getting there. The best I could hope for was somewhere warm to hunker down. I don't know how long I walked, but I saw something in the dark that caught my attention. A fire under a bridge. Kind of weird, I guess. Like, you see barrel fires in TV shows, but I'd never actually seen one in real life. There's just this one man, slumped against the wall, sleeping by the fire. I was banking on him not, getting mad that I was coming to share the warmth, but I remember him opening his eyes to look at me. I remember the icy blue reflecting the flickering firelight before he went right back to sleep. I took that as permission and lay down, resting my head on my backpack. I didn't realize how cold I really was until I felt the warmth of the fire. Surprisingly warm. Lulled me right to sleep. I woke up when I felt cold again. Ice on the tips of my fingers. The fire was still going, but it got cold enough for frost to form, and to freeze some water gathering under the bridge. I heard cracks. I opened my eyes, and in the distance, I saw it. Another shadow. Woman-shaped. Skirt, blouse, hat, no eyes. Big smile, like a scar, jaggedly slashed along her face. Tall gray teeth, pitch black gums. I couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. More cracking, right above my head. And then, I heard another voice. The man beside me, almost like a growl, close to my ear. "That yours?" he said, and I looked at him, confused. I didn't understand what he was asking me, but he was looking right at it with those ice blue eyes, narrowed in wary vigilance. I told him, voice shaking so hard I could hardly understand myself, that they wouldn't leave me alone, that I was afraid of what they were waiting for. "I think they want me dead," I said, and all the man said to me was, "They do." He grabbed my wrist. I tried to struggle. I didn't know what he was doing. I was scared out of my mind, but he kept trying to look at the thing that was just watching me from afar. He held my hand up, told me to calm down. He sounded so present that it stopped me long enough to notice what he was pointing to. I had this charm bracelet thing, something one of my closest friends made for me after a bad breakup I had just a few weeks before. I'll explain in a sec, she's a jeweler, right? And I just had a bad breakup involving some of these tiny, hand-painted porcelain figures, meant to go in a set. Vintage. It was a shared interest I had with my, boyfriend, at the time. I still had a couple of the figures with me after the whole thing, so she helped me feel better by putting them on there as a charm. I'd worn the thing since I got it, so I just didn't think about it, until I realized that was what the stranger wanted to see, and one of the figures looked just like the woman who was watching me. There was a final deafening crack, and the stranger jerked me forward. I hit my head against his shoulder. It was that hard, but I couldn't complain when I heard this gigantic icicle shatter right where I'd been lying. He took the bracelet right off my wrist and threw it straight into the barrel fire, which seemed to explode to life like it was devouring it. I watched the shadowy woman reach out, one hand over her heart and one hand reaching desperately towards me as she screamed without a voice, like breath leaving a body, before she burned away right in front of my eyes. The man eased me off him and stood, and I realized right then how tall he really was. Striking, imposing, backlit from the fire from where I sat, disoriented. He looked like a giant, broad and tall and eyes like ice, still so bright even when the rest of his face was in shadow. He held a hand out to help me up, and pulled me up with little effort, though I'll be the first to admit I'm not the biggest guy or anything. His silhouette wasn't as striking when I was finally on my feet, but the man was still pretty damn big. Right before my eyes, he eased down into a bit of a slump, and it was like, like Clark Kent in Superman. Nothing magical about it, but it was like he was a different person entirely. Like a guy you'd see shuffling along downtown. But his eyes were still the same color. I couldn't stop looking at them. He told me I was safe for now, but asked me if I had any other weird old cursed objects I might be carrying around with me, like a sap. Those were the only two I had, but I was so scared I forgot something that I asked if he'd come with me to see. To make sure. I didn't know exactly what he was, but I knew that he was the only one to give me answers, to help me, save me from whatever had cursed me in the first place. He looked like he was going to say no, but I was desperate. Grabbed his hand one more time, big enough to fill both of mine, and begged him. All I could think about was what almost happened to the kids. What would happen if I didn't come into the room in time, if I didn't wake up, if I didn't... He looked at me with pity. And something else, though I only learned what it was later. He agreed. We walked back to my place. I'd apparently caught the first real snow of the season, but I stayed warm enough. Warmer than expected, walking by him. Got home around the witching hour, snuck the strange man round the back, just like college. Anyway, I looked through my room, couldn't find another piece, not that I expected to. I threw the rest of the set away. Or down. On the floor. At my ex's apartment. I thought maybe since the two little figurines were the only ones I had, that was it. No more curse, no more bad luck, no more near-death experiences. No more horrible, smiling things. You probably guessed by now that I was not that lucky. I looked out the window after going through my things, and I saw it. Another one. Under the streetlight, smiling at me. Teeth almost taking up its whole face. Tall hat covering its eyes, if it had any at all. The old man, the stranger, saw what I saw. Said it was passing strange, because if that thing was manifesting here, then there should be an object nearby, that he should be close enough to feel it. I told him what I knew, that the rest of the set was somewhere else and had been for over a month now. I asked him what was so strange, especially for a man like him, who just dealt with the strangest thing I'd ever seen in my life, and who seemed to know way more than I could ever hope to know. He told me something like, these things should be tied to objects, that if he destroyed the objects, that these manifestations should disappear. But somehow, because apparently this was something he'd never seen before, these manifestations had latched onto me, and not just the cursed things I'd been carrying on me. As soon as I learned that, I knew I had to leave. I didn't even stop to say goodbye to my family. I just had to make sure they were safe and far away from me. Maybe I could call them, explain why, once they started looking for me, but either way, I was prepared to just go. I could deal with that, as long as they were safe. But the stranger, he put a hand on my shoulder and told me that I shouldn't think like that. That he could maybe still fix the problem if we went to find the missing pieces of the set. Hearing it from him was, interesting. He was so stoic. So serious. And the way words formed from his gray-bearded lips sounded like he had no patience for anyone, anything, or the world. But he was being kind anyway. Or trying to be. I wanted to go straight to my ex's old place to start the search, but I was exhausted from the night. Flagged pretty much as soon as I was far enough away from my house that I was confident they'd be safe. We passed by a park halfway there, and he told me to rest. Said I needed to be ready for what we'd find when we got to our destination. I slept on a bench, and he sat near my head, humming something softly while I drifted off. Danny boy. I thought that was funny, so I fell asleep, smiling. I woke up blinded by the noonday sun, and he asked me what was so funny, like no time had passed at all. I asked him if he knew my name was Danny. Danny Boyd. He looked so taken aback, and I couldn't help but laugh. I was so scared of him just the night before, but right then I'd felt safer than I'd felt in ages. I asked him what his name was. It took him a while to answer, but when he did, he said, Cornelius. He said something else too, but Cornelius was the name I heard in all the other stories you shared, so that's the only one I'll use. I don't know if he wants me to share the other one, but I did realize, from the name he gave, that he was a father. Or had been, at one point. Even as we walked, I kept seeing them around me. More than one at one point. The man with the hat, a child thing with big black eyes that kept waving at me, a woman with a red parasol and red lips, who put a gray finger to her mouth, like she was telling me to keep quiet. Cornelius told me that I'd be safe so long as I stayed with him. I tried to refuse when he said we should eat, but he wouldn't take no for an answer. I asked him, when we did eat, why he was being so kind to me. Why he was taking care of me, when he'd only known me for a day. He said he thought it was what I needed. He wasn't very forthcoming, but I figured out what he was getting at, and I'll be honest, I was a little pissed. I understood that it was probably some kind of instinct for him, but I told him I didn't need to be fathered, or whatever he thought he was doing. He didn't deny it, so I was definitely right on the money. I know, it's silly, but I had a good dad, good parents. No issues with them, daddy, mommy, or otherwise. It was just so galling to have someone try to be something I didn't want them to be, especially not if they thought they were doing it for my sake. And it felt wrong, too, to be some kind of proxy for whatever happened to... It was just wrong, especially with him. Sorry, this isn't relevant. I was thankful that he was looking out for me, especially with the curse still latched onto me, and the things that wouldn't stop haunting my every step. I was starting to get used to the stares on my back from those awful things, but it was clear that they couldn't get close enough to do anything, or that Cornelius was warding off the effects of the curse, somehow. Every now and then I'd see his icy eyes glow, though it was hard to spot in the sunlight, and I realized he was using whatever power he had to keep me safe. When we finally arrived at my ex's old house, a narrow but tall corner townhouse that had seen better days, there was practically a procession. A handful on the opposite street, a couple on either corner. They all looked so pleased, even if their expressions never actually changed. But they were all waiting, anticipating what would happen when we finally walked through the door. The first thing I noticed about the place was that the windows were dark. Not a sign of life, and when I came closer, I saw that the mailbox had been stuffed to the brim. There was a pile of junk mail, letters, and even a couple of packages gathering dust at the front door. Not a great sign, but knowing my ex didn't even have the decency to help me through this damn curse made me more angry than scared, and I jumped the little brick wall that surrounded the place and went round the back to find his spare key. Still under the same rock and everything. I looked up into the window that would have looked into his bedroom, our bedroom, once, and I thought I saw him. Just for a second. He was smiling at me, like he was happy to see me, even after everything. He said something, and it was like I could hear him calling out, the way he used to when he saw me come home. Cornelius grabbed my arm and demanded to know what I was doing, going in alone, and that was enough to shake me out of that moment of confusion. I realized right then that I was gripping the back door handle, not knowing how I crossed the distance, and when I looked up, my ex was gone from the window. He was so angry, so worried about me. He told me he was sure we were in the right place, that there was a wrongness overflowing from this place that he had grown familiar with, but somehow off. Worse in some ways, but more than anything, He told me I should stay back while he burned this place to the ground to make sure he was being thorough, but I told him no. After all, I'd just seen my ex-boyfriend in the window. He was definitely still in there, no matter what I'd seen on the front porch, and even after everything he did, I just couldn't let him die. Cornelius stood at full height, and suddenly I remembered why I'd been so afraid of him, when he told me, gravel voice cold as ice, that my friend was already dead. I may have said some, harsh words in reply. I wasn't gonna let him burn the entire goddamn house down without making sure there was nobody left inside. Fuck, even if it wasn't my ex, I couldn't live with myself if someone burned to death in a place I used to call home, knowing I could have stopped it. I do regret throwing his son in his face, though. I believe my exact words were, "What if it was your son in there? Or do you not care enough to check before you burn someone to death?" It was like everything that made him powerful suddenly went away, collapsing this imposing, powerful figure into the hunched, feeble old man he pretended to be. Though I wasn't feeling particularly empathetic at the time, I just shoved the key in the door and threw it open, intending to run through the place, see if anyone was there. If Cornelius thought it was that dangerous, I wasn't going to stay long, but I just wanted to make sure. He grabbed my arm before I could walk through the threshold. He didn't say anything, but he pulled me, gently, but firmly, close, telling me I shouldn't cut contact for any reason while we were inside. I didn't quite understand why until we passed by the living room, and I almost screamed when I saw every single one of those things sitting on every couch and chair, every head turning at once to watch us walking. Smiles wide and unchanging, though they seemed to stretch and tense when we got to the foot of the stairs. The whole place was dark, though sunlight crept in from between the drawn curtains. I climbed the steps without ever letting go of Cornelius' arm, and when I got to the top of the stairs, I saw the bedroom door. It was clearly open, though from that angle I couldn't see inside just yet. I gently called out my ex's name, but there was no response. I tried to breathe through my racing heart as I called again, and this time I got a response. "Danny? Baby?" It was his voice. I felt relieved for just a second, but Cornelius tightened his grip on my arm, and I saw inside the guest room right as we walked by. Right by the door stood a tall, gray man with wide, painted eyes, grin taking up half his face, white gloved hand held up in a gentle wave. His bulbous, clumsily painted eyes followed us as we moved forward, and, ever so quietly, I heard a sound. Like laughter. The strange, solitary tall man was giggling, his shoulders shaking. "Danny." I finally arrived at our old bedroom, and the first thing I noticed, even in the dark, was how pristine it was. Bed made, nothing on the table, no figurines littering the floor where I left them on the carpet. But I smelled something horrible as we walked in. Didn't know what. I told Cornelius the rest of the set wasn't where I last saw it, but that I could try looking around to see if it had been put away somewhere. He shook his head, told me that he could feel it, just like he felt the little figurines on my bracelet. But the way he said it sounded resigned, so I asked him where he could feel the rest of the figurines. "Everywhere," he said, shaking his head. He told me we never should have entered the building, that he ought to have burned everything down, but then he hissed through his teeth and said, no, it probably wouldn't have worked anyway. The focus, that's what he called it, the cursed objects he'd dealt with in the past. It was unlike anything he'd ever encountered, and the closest thing he could think of was an incident years ago, when a young boy had been absorbed by the focus he held and tried to take another boy with him. Half in, half out of what he called a miasma, a state of unreality where fear reigned supreme. The focus, he said, ought to have gone dormant already. It shouldn't still be active. It shouldn't have latched onto me from so far away. Something made the curse find me, even if I hadn't been there since the breakup. And apparently, the only way I could break free was if we found the actual figurines, in the miasma itself, in the place of unreality where my worst fears would come to life. Boy, did I regret forcing my way into the house right then. There was something he didn't tell me, but that I could pick up from his careful words. That my ex was in there too, wherever we were going. I thought there was still a chance to help him if we went through, but... I agreed. He wrapped his arm around mine, reminding me not to let go. The doorframe caught fire, and I caught a glimpse of what was beyond it. The same hallway, but falling apart. Wood rotting, water dripping from the ceiling. A bony leg barely in view on the floor. We walked through together, and everything around us was falling apart. The floorboards creaked under our weight, and I worried we'd fall right through. We passed the guest room once again, and the painted-eyed man was gone. I almost would have preferred if he stayed. Then I wouldn't have had to see what was there in the room behind him. I recognized things I didn't take with me when I walked out the door, covered in translucent red film, over and across every corner. A series of membranes surrounding my things like membranes around a heart, and pulsing subtly the same way. The blood seeped into my shoes as we walked by, but Cornelius seemed unfazed. The leg I'd seen from the doorway was gone, but it didn't make the floor any more pleasant to walk on. And walking down the steps was a little more harrowing than walking up, with how loudly the wood creaked. I walked in front of Cornelius, and he kept me upright with a steady hand around mine. Right as I was about to reach the bottom, I felt something. A bony hand grabbing my ankle, even when there shouldn't have been any gaps between the steps. Still, there it was, and I barely had time to warn Cornelius before it pulled me down, and my hand slipped right out of his grip as my head slammed hard against the wooden step. I heard him shout my name right before I passed out. I woke up, and I was home. Not with my parents and siblings, at the house I shared with my boyfriend. Just moved in. There was nothing wrong. Nothing to worry about. I was the luckiest guy in the world. I kissed him goodbye before getting ready for work. When I was finally headed out, I stopped at the door of our bedroom for a second, though I didn't know why. Then it hit me. His birthday! God! I forgot his birthday. I needed to get him something for his birthday, something special. He just started getting into collecting weird vintage stuff, something that he worried about being mocked for, back before we got together. Halfway through my shift at the cafe, we had to close early. Power outage. A bit of an anomaly, but nothing too crazy. I wasn't going to complain. I was planning to pass by an antique store in Danforth on the way back home, and this gave me time to get in before closing. As soon as I saw it, I knew it was the perfect gift. A set of little figurines, hand-painted, not very well in some cases, but still. Seemed like someone put a lot of love into making it. A picturesque microcosm of a small Toronto park back in the day, all kinds of people populating the space. I couldn't wait to bring it home to my boyfriend. I got home way before my shift ended, but I wanted to surprise him. I knew he was working from home that day. A couple of the figurines had fallen over, so I figured I'd fix them later, and stuff them into my pocket so I wouldn't lose them. As I walked through the door, something was off. I thought I heard something like crackling and humming. I passed by the living room and I saw that the fireplace was on. We figured out how to make it work for winter last year, but I wasn't sure why he decided now was a good time to leave it running. I looked at the couch and love seats, checking for signs that my boyfriend had spent some time warming himself by the fire, but no dice. For some reason, I thought I'd find something else there. I walked up the steps carefully, balancing my gift as I got to the top. I was so excited I was humming a song, not sure what, and I nearly dropped the whole thing when, almost out of nowhere, my boyfriend appeared. "Whoa, Danny, baby, careful," he said. He helped me balance the whole set, some of them tumbling over, but most secured in the scene. "What's all this?" I smiled, excited to greet him a happy birthday, but I saw one of the figurines fall on the carpeted floor, and he asked me if I was okay. I wasn't sure. Now I know why. But back then, I didn't remember. Didn't remember that this wasn't how that day went. He didn't greet me at the top of the steps, help me with my gift, gushing all the while. He didn't perch them on the table, hold me and kiss me in our room, and we didn't have a perfect dinner to celebrate a year of being together. That's not what happened. I walked over to our shared bedroom, alone, with the gift in my arms, excited to see his reaction. And the first thing I saw when I stepped into the open door was clothes on the floor. Bare feet on the bed. 2 sweat-drenched bodies all tangled up in and out of the sheets. They only noticed me when I dropped the whole damn thing, loud enough to clatter even on the carpet. The last thing I saw was a look of devastation on his face, one hand holding the sheet to his chest, the other hand reaching out to stop me. I didn't even look back. I'd moved some of my stuff in that week, but I barely had anything with him but clothes and essentials. Nothing I'd want to take with me or care to collect. I just grabbed a bag I hadn't unpacked from the guest room and left that night. Left him alone with my gift on the floor and never heard from him again. But I only remembered that when I asked him about the fireplace. He looked confused. A little angry, like he had no idea who lit the fireplace, but it wasn't him. It was like a domino effect. Thinking of the fireplace, I remembered the living room. Dark and full of smiling faces. I looked back at my feet and remembered the gift figurine spilling out on the floor. And when my boyfriend embraced me, I pushed him away. "Please," he said, "don't leave me again." And I turned away to walk out the door because my instincts were suddenly screaming at me to run. When I passed the guest room, something grabbed me, gloved hands, a tall, gray man whose gentle laughter seemed to coalesce into murmured words. "Don't leave. Don't leave. Danny. Danny. Danny." I struggled as it tried to pull me back, but it pulled me, swallowed me deeper into the room where all my things that I'd abandoned had been put together, and now me with them. But even from there, I could smell it. The smell of burning. And I heard the giggles turn into a scream as its hands caught fire, and it let me go. I tore out of its grip and ran, skipping stairs down and tripping near the bottom, but still, I kept going, bruised knees be damned. I got to the living room, not the front door nor the back. The living room, where the fire burned. But now it was filled with smiling figures. Tall gray teeth and black gums, all of them reaching out with cold hands when I pushed my way through the fire. They tried to grab me, tried to pull me back. But I could hear it. Like a song. Like I needed to wake up. When I looked at the figures grabbing me, I realized each was only grabbing me with one hand, the other on their chests. A perfect mirror of how my boyfriend looked the night I left him. I think I understood even then why this curse had latched onto me, what made it different from the rest. I also understood that I was the one that brought this curse into his home. Our home, once. That this wouldn't have happened if not for... I reached into the fire. I was scared I'd be burned, of course, because it felt hot to the touch. Felt just like it'd burn me if I got too close. but I had to take it on trust. So I threw myself into the fire, and it devoured me, searing heat all around, and then it was like a warm embrace, like feeling safe after being afraid for so long. Then I woke up in the empty, dusty, worn-down living room, Cornelius shaking me awake. I was curled around my half-broken gift, every figurine on the painted green grass. He took it from me and burned it almost without fanfare right in front of my eyes with fire he summoned from nothing. It was done, he said. But before we left, I needed to see something. He seemed reluctant, but accepted that it was something I needed to know. So I went up those stairs one last time, and to our bedroom. In the bed lay my boyfriend's body, smelling of rot, but while he was halfway rotten, his skin seemed to have crystallized in some places, almost like he was turning into white stone, or porcelain. Near his head, where he looked like he was only sleeping, there was a picture frame, the one we kept on the bedside table, of the two of us having fun at the C&E. I thought maybe I should take it with me. Remember. But I felt a hand on my arm, and Cornelius told me, as gently as he could, that he would have to burn this place to cinders, so they would not find this. This inexplicable, horrific thing that would have to be reported to his parents, his family members, investigated by the authorities, become a novelty, an oddity, a mystery to be solved that would never have answers. I agreed if he could promise nobody else would get hurt. He made that promise with a squeeze of my arm, and we stepped outside, and I watched the house I lived in for only a month burn, heard sirens from afar as firefighters rushed to the scene. When the news reported it later, they'd say it was a miracle the fire didn't spread at all past the first house and its surrounding gate. And everyone got to think that only one man died in his sleep that very night. I see him sometimes, Cornelius. I got to go home because of him. I was saved because of him. I thought I'd never see him again, even when I asked if I could. He seemed surprised by that, implied that he thought I hated him for what he put me through. But I couldn't hate him. God, no. There were some things he said about his son hating him. I had to remind him that I was not his son and I never would be anything close. But I did care about him. I wanted him to know that. It was only 2 days, but it felt like a lifetime. I made him promise to say hello if he ever saw me again. That I definitely would if I saw him. Sometimes I find myself humming that song at work. Sometimes I see him wandering around and we sit together. I buy him food, ask him to come see me at the cafe. There's always so much he doesn't tell me, so much that seems to be weighing him down that I don't quite know about. I know I can't take it on faith that he's a good guy because I don't know everything about him. I don't know everything that he's done. But I take it on faith anyway. And maybe one day I'll know exactly who he is, and I'll hate him. But for now, For now, all I know is that his name is Cornelius. He wanders Toronto, creating fire from nothing. Some call him the Old Man of Toronto. Some call him an angel. And some have seen him burn down houses not knowing if there were still people inside. When he stands at full height, he almost looks like a giant, but too often he's bent over, looking fragile and frail. And he has those eyes like ice. And he saved my life.
You're listening to Hainai by Motzie Dapul. Hey everyone, it's Motzie. The situation in Gaza has not gotten better. Israel continues to slaughter civilians, and their government seemingly has no intention of stopping this genocide, despite the killing of over 16,000 children. They continue to refuse ceasefire deals and have attacked schools, hospitals, and refugee camps. Their bombs have dismembered and decapitated children, bombs sent by the USA. These are all factual statements. Israel has been committing a violent and ruthless genocide against a country that is almost 50% children, and has been for months, and they have been doing so with impunity. They have also been violently stealing land from people in the West Bank. Please continue supporting efforts to divest from Israel, acknowledge the Palestinian state, and sanction Israel for its genocidal war crimes. I've added updated resource links in the description. I'd also like to encourage you to continue buying eSIMs for Gaza, as they are running low, and this is the best way to ensure that communication continues in Gaza between Palestinians. I've also added links where you can donate to or support aid groups on the ground delivering food and medical aid to Palestine. Though the governments are slow to act, the world continues to stand with Palestine, and we will see a free Palestine in our lifetime. Keep going, but take care of yourself. Stay safe, and kalayaan para sa Palestina.
Crimes of the Marxes. It's no surprise that martial law sought to suppress much of the masses. But if you thought Marcos only targeted anti-government movements, you would be wrong. All forms of progressive movements were militaristically silenced, including the growing activism of the LGBTQ+ community. Transgender women and gay men in particular were constant targets of harassment and even torture from military authorities. The LGBT community was further stigmatized by Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos themselves. At their behest, Tears in the Morning by Eddie Carnes was published in 1979. It's an anti-gay book described as violently vitriolic against the gay community. Many of the LGBT were forced to flee abroad to escape abuse, and some were even exiled. However, despite Marcos's efforts to stifle them, he could not stop their spirit. The 70s saw the rise of disco culture, allowing more outlets for LGBT expression. This led to more LGBT spaces to blossom and more LGBT voices to be empowered. The political landscape of the time also led to more LGBT stories to be produced as forms of protest. Sword speak, an earlier form of today's Becky language or Filipino gay lingo, also emerged and made its way into the people's common slang. Today, the Filipino LGBT community still face constant discrimination in the country, but they continue to be the loudest voices of activism and leaders in culture. They are present in all fights not just against LGBT discrimination, but against the corrupt and imperialist powers that continue to plague us.
Hey everyone! Hope you enjoyed going down memory lane with our recap eps, but we are happy to be back with our main story. This is Reg Helly, co-creator and co-producer of Hainai. Hainai is a podcast produced by Motzie Dapul, Yoy Halago, Alisa Jimenez, and me, and licensed under Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share-alike 4.0 International License. This episode was co-produced by Jesse Goodsell and written and directed by Motzie Dapul, who also plays the role of Other Mary. The role of our very own Danny Boyd was played by Edward McKee. If you'd like to chat with other listeners when this episode goes live, we do a live premiere every other Sunday at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time or Toronto time on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/HiNaiPod. If you want to help support the production of Hainai, you can subscribe to our Patreon, patreon.com/HiNaiPod. You'll get to be part of our early access program where we released episodes 3 days early on Thursdays at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time or Toronto time. You can also get bonus video, audio, art, and so much more. Speaking of Patreon, we'd like to give a shout out to the following rockstar patrons for all their amazing support: Victoria Goodwin, Sooks, Pablo Neurotic, Melissa, Megan, Malaya Light, Madeline Hicks, Jaden, Faye Fungi, Evie Smith, Emma Halig, Diana Cause, Danny, Baka Terrier, Astra Kim, Amelia Brownstein, and Jesse Goodsell. If you can't subscribe monthly, you also have the option to buy us a milk tea on Ko-fi at ko-fi.com/HiNaiPod. That's ko-fi.com/HiNaiPod. Our ad-free Hainai album, which has our official music and full episodes from Act 1 and 2, is also available on both Patreon and the Ko-fi store. Check out our website, HiNaiPod.com, for more news and updates, and don't forget to follow us on our blog, HiNaiPod.tumblr.com, as well as our socials, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at HiNaiPod. Hainai is available on Acast and wherever you listen to podcasts. Hope you enjoy our Act 3 episodes, and as always, thank you, we love you, and hanggang sa muli.